Thank you for coming. My name is Colin Oriens. I'm the director of the Environmental Studies program, and I'm really pleased that we can bring you a really stimulating lecture every week. This is called the Hope Cunningham Environmental Lecture Series, and it's made possible by a very generous donation by Tufts alumni Daphne Hoke Cunningham and Roland Hoke. If you'd like to sign up to receive alerts about this lecture series, or if you're a student and you want to receive our student newsletter, please go to the link that's in the chat, and you can sign up for one or both. And then if you're interested in the previous talks or upcoming talks, there's a second link that we're going to put in the chat, and most of our talks are recorded, so you can even go back and view a previous talk if you're interested. As far as today's lecture is concerned, the chat is disactivated. So if you have any questions for our speaker, we encourage you to put them into the question answer section. Or if you prefer to raise your blue hand, I can try to call on you. This meeting will be recorded and available on the Environmental Studies website. So now I get to welcome today's speaker. Super excited. In just a few short years, Bina Venkataraman has had a fascinating and varied career after graduating with a BA in International Relations and Environmental Studies, which, by the way, is a really common double major here at Tufts too. From Brown in 2002, she completed a Fulbright, worked as a communications and research coordinator at the Rainforest Alliance, and then was selected as a Princeton and Asia Fellow working in Hanoi, Vietnam. Later, all along the way, she realized that she loves writing and she loves communicating. And she found her way into the world of journalism. She worked for the New York Times and the Boston Globe as a journalist. She became director of the global policy initiatives at the Broad Institute and was a senior advisor in the Obama White House, covered things like climate change and the Ebola crisis. And now she's the editor of the Boston Globe editorial page. Her goal, in her own words, is to highlight the diverse voices of our city and better showcase Boston's groundbreaking ideas and knowledge while holding our leaders and institutions accountable for meeting high expectations for public service. She also received a master's in public policy from Harvard. To everything she does, she brings great energy, a passion for communication, and a determination to make our world a better place. Bina, thank you for joining us today. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Colin. That was such a generous introduction, and I'm glad you hearkened back to my environmental studies days as an undergrad, because I hope there's some undergrads watching, and if in the Q&A we want to talk more about what all the things you can do with an environmental studies background and why I am a big believer in it as a way of approaching the world and approaching academics. I'm happy to do that. That's not exactly what the talk's going to be about, but thank you so much for having me, Colin. Thank you to the whole program at Tufts on environmental studies for hosting this. And thank you also, Sarah Gomez, for organizing and making sure I got here on time and in the forum I am now. I wish I could be with you in person. So we're going to talk today about thinking ahead in a reckless age, which is the subtitle of my book, which is called The Optimist Telescope. And we're going to talk about it in the context of how do we think ahead as an entire society? How do we do it at the individual level, at the organizational level, the community level? But then really, how do we do this for the sake of the planet? But I want to start at a much simpler place. I want to start by asking you all to do a little exercise with me. And the reason for this, I should say, this is not how I used to talk about these ideas of thinking ahead and long-term thinking. But since we've been in this pandemic, I just feel it's important to acknowledge that almost everyone I know, I'm sure everyone tuned in today, has been through some sort of trauma in the last few months, is maybe experiencing that trauma right now. We are definitely in a public health crisis. We're in an economic crisis. Many of us are dislocated from our friends, from our colleagues, from our families. And that takes a serious toll. And the reason I think it's connected to this topic of long-term thinking and thinking ahead is that it can feel like a luxury to think ahead when you have a lot of immediate problems and immediate challenges when you're in crisis. But I want to offer a sort of counter view to that conventional wisdom, which is that to escape from current reality, to think about the long term, can also be a source of relief, a source of optimism, and a source of perspective on the time we're living in right now. So the exercise I'm going to invite you to do, and I'm going to be quiet for a few moments, which is very unusual for me, while we all do this together, is to invite you to imagine the future. And I want you to think at least 15 years in the future, 20, 25 years, let's say. And imagine a person, imagine either your future self 20 or 25 years from now, or if you prefer, imagine a young person in your life, a child, a niece, a nephew, a grandchild. And think about, populate that image as I'm talking here with where that person is. Where are you 20 years from now? What does your neighborhood look like? What are you doing? And then when, in a few moments, as I'm going to be quiet, I want you to think about what are some of the things you would tell this future person, this person 20 or 25 years from now, about how you got through the time you're in now, about how you managed it, about what the world was like, how you engaged with the challenges facing the world, facing the planet. What would you want this person to know, and how would you like to convey that? So with that, I'm just going to take a little pause here. Feel free to jot some ideas down on paper if you have it, or keep them in your mind if you prefer. So I'm sure this was not nearly enough time to do justice to this exercise, but if you find this useful, especially as I explained to you a little bit more about why we did this, I invite you to continue to populate these ideas for a possible letter to your future self or to a future child to be opened in the future. What this is an exercise in what some behavioral economists call perspective taking. I like to think of it as a form of imaginative empathy, to not just imagine a future scenario like sea level rise, or a future scenario like global trade, or the merging of two nations, but instead to take the perspective of a human being living in the future and to try to relate to that human being from the point of view of the present. Now, I got very interested in the techniques of perspective taking or imaginative empathy because there's been some evidence that shows that if you can help people better imagine not just a scenario in the future, but empathize and have emotions around that, be able to populate it with vivid sensory details, that can be helpful in, for example, improving people's engagement around issues like climate change. So part of the problem that this is solving, this idea of imaginative empathy, is the challenge that we have with imagining the future. So for most people, surveys show people across many different countries and many different cultures, the future goes dark in our imagination after about 15 years. For many of us in our daily lives, amid distractions, immediate deadlines, demands, immediate crises, the news cycle, even just thinking beyond the next week can be very difficult. And if you think about it from the point of view of human biology and human history, it's actually quite unusual that human beings as a species do think about the future and plan for the future, right? Most species don't conjure the future in their minds like that. They kind of do things out of instinct, like squirrel away the nuts for winter. But human beings actually conjure the future. That doesn't mean it's easy for us. We have to basically invent and concoct these scenarios, rearranging episodes of our past, rearranging sort of sensory input we get. Whereas for what we're concerned with in the present, if I want to buy something right now, I can see it there on the counter or on the Amazon screen. Or if I want to indulge in a treat, I can smell that donut on the counter, and it's reinforced by my senses, and I'm taking it in a very vivid way. Whereas the things that I want in the future, or that I want for society, or that I don't want to happen for society in the future, I have to invent, concoct, conjure in my mind. And the fact that humans can do this is both miraculous, but it's also a limited skill, a limited expertise, because we're not always so great at it, and we rely mostly on our memory to do it. So these are some of the concerns that drove me to write this book, The Optimist Telescope, which is the insights from this book are what we're going to be talking about today, though we'll probably fan out in the Q&A to talk about anything that's on your mind that relates to these ideas. And the reason for it is that this idea of thinking ahead, of being able to both imagine the future, but also act for the sake of the future, rather than just acting on our immediate interests, is so important, whether we're talking about saving for our own retirement, whether we're talking about businesses heeding risks, like the risks that led to the financial crisis of about a decade or so ago, where you had industries and you had companies neglecting very clear risks. It's also important for society. And I think the pandemic we're living in is a poignant example of that, that if you don't heed early warning signs, you end up with a much worse problem. You end up with exponentially more cases of COVID in your country, like the United States. You end up with a harder, more expensive problem to solve down the road. And of course, with climate change, that is very much the case. The more early warning signs we neglect, the longer we wait, the higher the costs are in the future, the higher the humanitarian costs, the economic costs. The more difficult it becomes to solve the problem. So if we could solve this issue of being able to think ahead, we could do so much better. And the impetus for writing this book for me came from my time in the White House, which Colin mentioned, when I was working with leaders from the private sector, from companies, food companies, for example, working with mayors, sharing with them information and data about the changing climate. And this is now 6-7 years ago. And what I was doing was basically trying to help convince them through science, through information, that the threats of a warming climate were worth taking seriously today, in that case, 6 or 7 years ago. And these data around wildfire, floods, droughts were robust, right? They come from scientific studies that have been done over time. They come from peer-reviewed literature. They come from data sources that include satellites and sensor networks around the world. A lot of it federal government, taxpayer-supported research. And I found often that the problem wasn't exactly what I thought it was. It wasn't that people didn't have this information about future threats. It was rather that they were having trouble acting on future threats, given all the demands in the present. So company leaders would say, it's about my board and my shareholders. I'm really beholden to the quarterly cycle. These kinds of risks that are coming over 5 or 10 years are really too far in the future for me to think about planning in a serious kind of way in terms of investments, in terms of risk planning in my company. Now, some of this has changed because the more wildfires we see across the West, the more storms we see hit the Gulf Coast, like Eta, which is moving its way up into the US. We really see that the impacts of climate change are not so far in the future, right? They're actually right around the corner for many people. For many people, many communities, they've already experienced climate impacts. But we also know that the worst cost, the real damage, is still yet to come. It's still down the road. It still belongs sort of to the future. So I was at first kind of cynical about whether it's possible for human beings to do better at thinking ahead. I had this sort of belief that, well, maybe we're all just short-term thinkers. We're all like the hunter-gatherers on the plain, and we're really just only capable of reacting to what's right in front of us. So maybe this idea of trying to get people to heed warning signs about climate change is a pretty futile effort. It's tilting at the windmill, so to speak. And I took my cynicism about that, and eventually I became very curious, and that led me to pursuing the ideas and the research behind the Optimist Telescope. And my curiosity was really about that core question. Is it possible for human beings to think ahead? Is it possible for human organizations and societies to do better at thinking ahead and planning ahead for the future? Because certainly there are examples of it, right? We put human beings on the moon to walk on the moon. That was a long-term research project. We eradicated polio around the world. We built huge civilizations. We converted from hunter-gathering to sowing seeds for later harvest, modern agriculture, planning ahead, storing food for later use, distributing food all over the world. So clearly human beings have the capacity for this. It's just that we don't tend to do it that often, and we're not doing it on certain problems where we really need to be doing it. So part of this research, the research took me everywhere, I have to say. I was all over the world. I was talking to researchers in all kinds of disciplines, and this kind of goes back to the idea of environmental studies as this syncretic discipline, bringing together different academic research areas. So I interviewed biologists, economists, anthropologists, archaeologists, military historians, all kinds of experts for this book. And one of the core insights was that this idea of whether or not we can think ahead, it is not a matter of biology. It is not a matter of some people are good at thinking ahead and some people are terrible at it and might as well give up. It's much more a matter of choice. And one of the key examples of this, one of many examples of this, is the research on the marshmallow test. So a lot of people know about this famous experiment that was done in Stanford starting in the 1960s by a psychologist named Walter Mischel, where he offered toddlers the opportunity to have one treat right away, a marshmallow, pretzel, or cookie, or wait for an indefinite period of time to get a second treat. And he tracked those kids who waited for the second treat and found that later in life, they did better on their SATs and ACTs, they had higher grades, and they ended up earning more. And the popular interpretation of that long-term study, which for those of you who've been studying statistics or science, was a correlation, right, between these kids who waited for the second treat and the kids who did well, and doing well later as adults. It wasn't the case that that was necessarily the cause, right? Waiting for the second treat. And it wasn't also determinative. So the popular impression was there's just certain kids who are good at thinking ahead and delaying gratification and others who are not. And the rest of us are kind of doomed if we were the kids who just ate the first marshmallow. And if you look into the body of research that followed those initial marshmallow tests, what you find is a much richer picture. You find that if you put kids in groups where everybody wearing the red t-shirt is told that, you know what, all the other kids with the red t-shirt waited for the second treat, that the kids in those groups where they perceive a social norm, a peer norm, will wait for the second treat at much higher rates. Cultures where this has been studied that are less connected in the globalized world, like a subsistence farming community in Cameroon, where this test was given to toddlers with a local treat known as a puff puff, showed that kids in that particular culture and community passed this test at a much higher rate, probably owed to different cultural factors. And why do I think this is important? It's a bit of a deep dive into the marshmallow test that you might not have known you were going to hear about today. The reason is that many of our conceptions or our ideas, our assumptions about what makes it possible to think ahead, rely on a sort of shorthand that if you actually get deeper into the research and deeper into what's happened, the examples of what's possible, what you'll find, what I found, is that this is much more a matter of choice than it is of our programming, than it is of a sort of inevitability. And that, for me, is a source of optimism and a source of hope about what's possible in terms of our ability to think ahead. So I want to share with you, given this sort of framework of recognizing that we have a choice, 3 of the insights from the Optimist telescope that bear on how we can do better, how we can become a society of long-term thinkers. And there are many other such tools that we can talk about in the Q&A if you want, but these are sort of, I think, the 3 central findings that I want to share that I think could really move us in the right direction. And I wish that that this had been widely read by people responding to the pandemic. I should just say that much, because this book came out in August of 2019, but didn't have enough of an impact on responding to early warning signs for a very critical problem we're facing right now. So the first insight I would share is that we need to mind what we measure. So often, the way we measure our own success or the success of a business or an organization or even of a society is very much about finding some sort of empirical measure that's easy to count, something that's numeric. And too often, those measures are not reflective of what really matters in the long term. So if you measure how well you're doing at your job, or how successful you are, for example, not that you do this, but by how many emails you've answered in a week, you're probably very likely to be neglecting some of the long-term projects that would actually make you feel like you had a successful career. Maybe if you've done a lot of text messaging for the day, you feel like you've done a lot of work. If you've written a lot of words, you might feel like you've done a lot of work. This happens for writers and journalists a fair amount. Doesn't mean that you've actually done things that get you towards projects that matter in the long term. Well, this is also true for businesses. When businesses are focused just on quarterly profits, they might not be making the investments. In fact, data shows that companies that focus a lot on fulfilling their quarterly earning projections will sacrifice making investments in research and development for the long term. They will sacrifice investing in their human talent. And so those are down payments on the long term that they're neglecting just to make sure they make those quarterly numbers. For nations, looking at gross domestic product as a measure of growth can often hide what's actually happening in a society. The GDP of a country goes up when there is a natural disaster often. This is one of the things that Amartya Sen and Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel-winning economists, have pointed out, because there's all of a sudden this influx of goods sold, goods made and sold to respond to that major national disaster, that cyclone. And that's kind of perverse, right? Because what you might have at the same time that you're measuring a growth or an increase in what should be progress, you're actually undermining the basis for people's survival or thriving in that society. And one of the stories I tell in the book about this comes from South India. This is a photo, an image that I just took, happened to take in an auto rickshaw in South India, but these are not particularly women that I'm about to talk about. But what happened in India in the early aughts, sort of the first decade of the 21st century, is that there was a growing use of microfinance as a tool to help people come out of poverty. So there were a number of companies, for-profit companies, some nonprofits, going into India and making these small loans, particularly to women, to groups of women, with the idea that if you lend people who are poor small amounts of money, they can use that to start businesses, buy livestock, do things that then help kind of catapult them out of poverty, generate income over time. Well, it's a very noble idea. It's won a Nobel Prize itself. You might know about the Grameen Bank, and it's worked in a lot of contexts around the world. But the problem that was happening at this time in India is that India became the place for an influx of these loans. It was going gangbusters. And these for-profit companies that were pouring these loans into the region were using a measure to tell everyone how successful they were. They were using a measure that proved to their investors they were successful. They were using a measure to prove to countries and governments that they were successful. And the measure was how much of the loans that they were lending to the poor were being repaid, so called a loan repayment rate. And they found that those rates were at 97 to 99%, that people were reliably paying back these formal loans. And so they used that to say, this is a success. We are seeing massive, alleviation of poverty. And what that measure was masking was that in many cases, people were using those loans to cover basic expenses, medical bills, emergencies, not necessarily to start income generating businesses. So these were people in true poverty. In many instances, people were over leveraged. So they had maybe a formal loan that they were repaying to the microfinance company, but they were also getting loans from sort of godfather-like figures in their communities who were shaking them down to get repaid. And so it was masking a lot of problems that were happening in this particular state in South India, where there ended up being a rash of suicides among villagers, because what was happening was far more complex than what the measure showed. It's a pretty dark cautionary tale. And one of the reasons I tell in the book is because even people with really good intentions, using the wrong measures, can be ignoring what matters in the long term. So we have to find better measures that are actual milestones for the kinds of progress we're trying to make. If the goal is to alleviate poverty, your measure better reflect whether you're alleviating poverty, right? The measure can't just be about something short-term and short-sighted. Okay, second insight is to stoke the imagination. So I gave you an exercise when we started, and if you fulfill that exercise later on, if you write a letter to your future self, you'll be doing one of the things that I talk about in the book in terms of being able to expand our ability to imagine future scenarios. Now, this really relates to climate change, because when it comes to climate change, we are calling on people to be able to imagine futures that they've never experienced in their lifetime, or perhaps that have never been experienced in human history on the planet, because we are dealing with unprecedented levels of warming, unprecedented kinds of climate disasters, and unprecedented kinds of social movements to respond to climate change, and ideas and technologies that could actually help us address it. So how do you get people to wrap their head around that? I mean, even if you think very locally here, several years ago, when people were trying to imagine what it would be like to have offshore wind farms off of Cape Cod, there were a lot of people who were imagining that in a very negative way. They thought that would just be like having an industrial plant out at sea where they would go sailing, or where they would have a view. And there are other people who imagine it a very different way. And I often think back to that, because I was a journalist covering at the time, and wonder what it would have been like if people had had a better way to imagine it in a collective way, in a way that they might have wanted to actually see that happen, how that could have turned out. So it's important to have these tools to stoke the imagination. And I just want to give a nod to history, because many of you are students, and with all the urgent crises facing us today, it may not always seem so relevant to take a history course and to expand your knowledge of strange and rare historical events. But expanding our range of history, the diverse cultures and countries from which we draw on when we think about historical examples as pointers towards what can happen in the future, can be very helpful in this cause of stoking the imagination. And the example I'll give that I write about in the book has to do with the Onagawa nuclear power station. This is a man, you can see the arrow, his name is Yanosuke Hirai, and he was the engineer who was responsible for certain design features of that power station. He insisted that it be built at a fairly high elevation, a higher elevation than was initially proposed. And he wanted it to have a higher seawall than was initially proposed, and he wanted it farther back from the coast. Now, in 2011, when the infamous Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station had its explosions and meltdowns, owed in part to seawater breaching the seawall that was protecting the reactor and flooding the backup generator, that Onagawa, the particular power station that I'm telling you about that this man was responsible for, was actually closer to the epicenter of the earthquake that caused that tsunami. And in Onagawa, people in the community fled to the nuclear power station because it was a place that was so safe. It was a place of refuge. Whereas we know what happened in Fukushima, even though it was farther from the epicenter of the earthquake, was so devastating. And the reason that Yanosuke Hirai insisted on this design for that nuclear power station, he didn't live to see what happened in 2011, but the reason he gave at the time was that he knew that in his hometown shrine, people told the story, and there had been a plaque in his hometown shrine that talked about the Jogan earthquake of 869, and the fact that that shrine had flooded, that temple had flooded. And so he was drawing on this long historical record, right? Not his own firsthand knowledge, but his knowledge of history, to imagine what might happen to that nuclear power station in a way that enhanced his ability to think ahead in a reckless age, his way of having foresight. The third insight I want to share with you is committing to a shared heirloom. So many of us in our families may have heirlooms. Some of them are just stories that we've been told by our parents or our grandparents, stories we might tell to our children. Some people have furniture or jewelry or any number of things. And as I was working on this book, I actually got a family heirloom, an instrument from my great-grandfather, which started to become a powerful metaphor for how I think we can do better at thinking about the future. So one of the challenges when it comes to thinking about future generations is that each generation now faces such different realities than the generation before it, or even than, we did when we were kids, right? If you just think of the amount of technological change that's happened, what does it mean to have a smartphone in your pocket? It's a very different reality than your parents faced when they were growing up, or when they were in their 20s, or when they were a young, even adults. My parents, when they first moved from India to the United States, were sending telegrams back to India. And now I think about the fact that, if I wanted to, and I did until my grandmother died, I could Skype with my grandmother, all around the world. And so it's very difficult just thinking about the pace of change and the accelerating pace of change of our culture and our society, what future generations will look like, what their lives will be like. So when you were trying to imagine that scenario for your letter, or for that potential exercise that I put in front of you, you might have had some trouble thinking about what that person's life might actually be like, because it is probably going to be very different, right? Society is probably going to look different in ways that are difficult to imagine. But so given that there are limits to our imagination, even if we stoke it, even if we use history, even if we bring in some of those exercises, it's important to have the humility to recognize that we don't know everything about future generations, that future generations will be different from us, but that what we do know is that what's been important to us in the past, the most meaningful things that have carried forth as being important to us in our lives in the past, or in our society, or on our planet in the past, are likely to be important to human beings in the future. And I think about shared resources when I think about this. I think about clean water, clean air to breathe. These are things that have been important in the past that are likely to be important in the future. One of the examples I talk about in the book of a shared heirloom is a lobster fishery off the Pacific coast of Mexico, where I spent some time, where a group of 8 or 9 communities, villages, and the people who live in them have gotten together and decided to protect the lobster in their waters like a shared heirloom. So they've banded together and they carefully police and monitor what they catch. They don't take the breeding lobster out of the waters. And the reason that they cite for doing this is really clear. They have passed this trade of fishing for lobster across generations, and they intend to keep doing that. And they don't want to overfish and leave the water bereft of this heirloom for future generations. They didn't use the word heirloom. That's my word for it. But there are other examples of this that happen at a much larger scale. If you think about the national park system in the United States, or at a global level, the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, there are ways in which societies establish these shared heirlooms. We decide that we need some sort of governance. So we create a law like the national parks, the law establishing the national park system. We offer resources, we protect them, the way these lobstermen police their fishery. There are park rangers. There are ways of investing in the national parks that help keep them over time. But most important is the third ingredient for shared heirloom, which is to create meaning for each generation. Each generation needs to become both stewards and fishermen, or fisher people. So each generation interacts with our national parks and has their own experiences in them. And that's what helps make them an heirloom. If a whole generation of people thought this was meaningless and never went to engage with them, or had experiences of their own or memories of their own, that heirloom would become endangered, because it wouldn't have the same connection to human beings generation after generation that can be passed from parents to children, that can be passed from uncles and aunts to nieces and nephews, and so on and so forth. So I invite everyone to think about, I guess if I wanted to leave you with one message with respect to what we can do to think ahead in our society, what we can do to think ahead in our lives, is to think about what a shared heirloom is that you care about, and to commit yourself, tithe your time, your resources, some of your career, your mind, your brain power, to helping protect that shared heirloom for the future, for future generations. And I think if we all did that, we would go a long way towards doing right by the future, not just for ourselves, but for the people who will be here for long, long, long years after ours. So I hope I left enough time for questions. I did. Oh, good. I spoke fast. Okay.
Thank you so much, Bina. That was really wonderful. I was thinking about my trip over this summer to Acadia National Park, and that was clearly a sense of a group of people who owned a lot of property on that island, having a shared vision of protecting it and making it a national park, which was it's interesting to put that in the perspective. So a reminder to the audience, if you could put your questions in the Q&A session, or because we're relatively small, I would really encourage you to raise your hand and we can allow you to talk and we can make this much more interactive. So please, raise your hand and we'll unmute you and allow you to talk and participate in a discussion. I'll just start while people are collecting their thoughts. I was wondering, as you were thinking about your time in the White House and this sort of idea of sort of getting us to sort of really think deeply about imagining a future, if you could maybe reflect on a conversation that you had with someone in some sector where you found that starting off by stopping and thinking about imagining a future kind of resonated and might have sort of contributed to how you sort of framed that in your book.
I wish I could claim that I figured this out while I was working in the White House. So I think that the frustration I faced with being a very data first kind of person, because I've worked as a science journalist, as you noted, and I was raised by scientists, and I always sort of think like, I think I came at a lot of the problems that concern me most, the health of people on the planet, most specifically, from the perspective of if you just give people the information they need, they will act on that information because people are smart and rational and they want to act on information. And some of that is very much the case for a lot of people, right? While we have irrational aspects, there are a lot of us who do, we take information and we try to act on that information. Mm-hmm. But the problem really is with these future-oriented problems or crises and challenges that we face, and opportunities really too, right? Because it's about, can we invest now for what could be really exciting and game-changing tomorrow? That there's a need to overcome the vivid sensory stimulation in the present that is constantly fighting for our attention and making the future always kind of get put on the back burner. And there's also a need for having that emotional connection, having the future not just be about the data-driven scenario, but about me understanding that there's going to be human beings alive in that scenario, and I need to think about them. But I will say, so as much as I didn't have these tools, it's sort of like I got inspired to write these tools because I felt kind of like I was failing at what I was supposed to be doing a lot. Mm-hmm. But I will say that there is a conversation I had with a food company executive. I sort of started talking about this that I didn't end up writing about in detail in the book because it sort of ended up feeling like a non sequitur, but who talked to me about his children. And so I do think what he said was, I care about this for my children. But then there was a curtain that fell. And he said, and then he talked about his shareholders. And what I think about when I think about that encounter today is, what if I had said, tell me more about your children? Where are they going to be in 2050? Do you expect them to work in the same industry? Do you think what kind of interests do they have? Like, what do you think they'll want to be doing? Do they like hiking? Do they, just engaging at a very personal level, which would have been unusual for a business meeting. But I think when it comes to these issues of the future, we kind of need to do that a little bit more. And for a lot of people, it's, their kids are the thing they care about more than anything else. My nieces, I care about them more than I care about anyone else, and as much as I care about anyone else, I should say. And so I think that aspiration is very human, just as much as our human weakness or our human desire for instant gratification is there. The human aspiration to do right by the future is also there. And you don't have to have young people in your life to feel it. I think it's a way of wanting to feel meaning in time. It's a way of wanting to feel like, I belong to something that's more than just my story. And I think if we can appeal to that more, we will be more successful. And if I had it to do again now, and maybe I will be doing work of that kind now, I think I would bring in more of these imaginative exercises, as well as that role of imaginative empathy that I just talked about.
Thank you so much. Scarlett, do you want to ask your question? You need to unmute yourself.
I wonder if she has to be unmuted. That was the
Oh,
case for
there you
me.
go. I think I figured it out. Hi, Bina. Thank you so much for being with us. I don't know that I can turn on my video, but it's not giving me an option. But yeah, no, I worked with Colin and Coco in the environmental studies program for a while with this Lunch and Learn seminar, and this has been an incredible one. So I'm really excited to be here today. I do research in antimicrobial resistance at Tufts, and I'm going on into graduate school. I'm preparing to study epidemiology. And AMR is another one of those issues where it's very theoretical right now. It's killing people and causing huge burdens of disease, but the percentage estimates for 2050 are that it may kill up to 10 million people per year, which is more than cancer, diabetes, and heart disease combined. Like, it's this huge future threat to public health. Same with the pandemic. It was kind of this future threat that we as Americans didn't really have an experience of in such a visceral way. So I guess my question is, have you noticed in kind of health threats, people reacting differently compared to climate change as a threat that's might not have as immediate a connection to our health? And how can we also focus on those threats in terms of paying attention to the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. And superbugs, antimicrobial resistance was a big focus for me too. And there's a whole chapter in the book about it, actually.
Cool. I have to read
it. But I'll just give you some thoughts that come from that. And I'd be very curious, maybe we can follow up later, but how this might play out in terms of how you think about charting your career and what you think the levers are for change. But I think you're absolutely right to identify it. I mean, people are talking about the next pandemic being a superbug, right? Being a bug that has established resistance to our known antibiotics. And this is a problem where a lot of the decision-making sits with physicians and nurse practitioners, to some degree with everyday citizens if they're urging their doctors to prescribe them an antibiotic, and that sort of thing. There's also government decision makers that need to invest in better research on new antibiotics, novel antibiotics, all that kind of thing that needs to happen, education campaigns. But I looked at it from the perspective of doctors, because I thought, how interesting that you have people who are trained as scientists, have more years of training, medical and scientific training, and empirical training, but they're a source of making short-term decisions in terms of feeding this problem when it comes to overprescribing antibiotics when they're not needed. And so that was one of the reasons I found it so fascinating, because it was such a good example of, you can know the science, you can know exactly what you need to do, but in order to make good long-term decisions, you need more than information. It's not, as I like to say, it's not enough to have a good forecast. You also need to have good foresight. So part of the answer there in the medical profession, I found, was to look at social norms and peer norms. So some of the interventions that have been the most useful have been those that come from behavioral research, behavioral science research, like in the United Kingdom, where they did this effort where they had letters written by high-profile British leaders to doctors who were in the lowest performing in terms of overprescribing antibiotics where they're not needed, and told them, look, 80% of your peers are doing better at this than you are. And it really worked. I mean, and they cut, millions of pounds in spending from the National Health Service by virtue of basically a sort of subtle, it wasn't public shaming. They got the letters, but they didn't get, publicly named and shamed, but just being told that they were prescribing outside their norm. There are other interventions like interrupting the moment of prescription with a pop-up in the electronic health record that asks you to provide a rationale for prescribing the antibiotic. And that has been shown to be effective in a few studies because it does two things. One, it interrupts that moment where we make quick decisions. And there's a big connection between having reduced bandwidth, whether that's time or attention, and making decisions that are not so good for our future selves, or for the long-term greater good in this case. And when that kind of pressure cooker situation is created and people make those kinds of decisions, right, if you can interrupt that with what I have called an impulse buffer. You can call it whatever you want. And the other is to have to put a rationale in a record that will be seen by your peers, right? If you have to write down something, you're more likely to say, let's get that test to make sure it's a real bacteria that will respond to this antibiotic before I say that I'm prescribing this antibiotic. So creating that, the sort of cultural norm. And it goes back to the marshmallow test, right? Because it's not just about that kid in the room. If you give that kid a sense of belonging to a peer group or a cultural group and what the norm is, you can actually change things. So when it comes to climate change, that if there's a difference between that and public health issues, I think that one of the challenges that we need to start really getting better at, and the people who talk about climate change and think about climate change is a public health problem, first and foremost. I mean, it's definitely an economic problem. It's a national security problem. But at the level which you want everyday citizens and people to be galvanized about it, it is absolutely a public health problem. And I think it's true that when people know there's a contagious disease out there, they have a response to that. It's an urgent response. And the challenge with climate change is that we're at a slower boil, and we have to draw connections between the broader trend of the warming climate and isolated incidents, not so isolated if you think of the wildfires that were burning, going on for weeks, but each one of them requires people to have a connection, not just the connection of don't go outside because there's smoke out there, but the connection that we have to do something deeper to solve the problem. And I think that's a big difference between the two.
Thank you. There's a question in the Q&A that I think actually sort of builds perfectly from what you've just said. It sort of tags on to the impulse buffer, the marshmallow test, which is, do you believe we must combat societal consumerism in order to see behavioral change highlighted in this talk and in your book?
It's a great question. Behavioral consumerism is not a term that I have used or know specifically the term, but I have thought about this, and in my thinking and writing about this topic, do address the way that technologies and products are designed to reinforce our tendency toward instant gratification, and that kind of consumer culture is something that we are fighting against when we try to do this kind of long-term thinking. So I think our gadgets in our pockets, right? I draw a metaphor between being in the casino in Las Vegas, where if you've ever walked through a casino anywhere, so I actually went to Las Vegas and went to a casino. I'll tell you more about that in a second. But but if you have ever been in one, or you've seen a movie with one, which I'm sure you have, you know that there are these slot machines, and they have the flashing lights, and they have the bells and whistles, and they're designed to reinforce, give you a little bit of something, a little dopamine rush, a little bit that keeps you going and keeps you hooked. And then the casino, if you're sitting at the slot machine, will bring you a drink, will bring you snacks for free, keeping you there, keeping you hooked to that ever immediate next moment, the next thing you might get. And how do you get perspective there? You can't. Well, I think we are carrying the casino with us in our pockets every day. And if you want to extrapolate that, if you're in any kind of consumer environment, which are computers, or consumer environments with ads being thrown at us left and right, it is very, very difficult to tune that out and focus on what's meaningful, what matters in the long term. And so what I would say is that, yes, ideally, we would not have technologies that reward us, with likes and hook us to the next. But, are we going to get rid of that culture? Are we going to get rid of those products? Probably not anytime soon. So what I try to do is offer a set of techniques that the individual can use, that the organization can use, that our society can use, right? Because we're going to need leadership. We need political leadership on these issues to get us out of that, what is essentially a loop of being compelled by the next moment, a compulsion loop.
That's really helpful, because we definitely live in an instant gratification kind of world right now. What are some techniques that you personally find yourself using each day?
Oh, so that goes back to going to Vegas. So I was really intrigued because I have a cousin who's a professional poker player. And he, when I told him I was writing this book, he said, oh, you should really talk to some professional poker players. He didn't mean himself, but, and I kind of laughed at him and I was like, why would I do that? And he said, well, what's really interesting is, there are a lot of these guys, mostly guys, I have to say I interviewed a couple women, including an incredible chess champion and poker player named Jennifer Shahade. She was one of my favorite interviews, but the majority of these professional poker players, he was relating to me, do what they do. They earn like 6-figure kind of salaries playing poker in a year. And many of them do it in a way that is very much about resisting instant gratification and impulsive behavior. And so I got kind of intrigued by that suggestion, and I ended up going and interviewing poker players around poker tournaments and watching what they do and asking them about their techniques, and finding that there were some of them that could be useful in our own lives and in my life too. And one of them is like to actually imagine scenarios before they happen that could get in the way of you doing what you really want. So for example, if you have a desire to exercise 3 days a week or something like that, and you kind of do this little scenario planning with yourself, but it's more than just scenario planning. So that's the first step. You ask yourself, what could get in the way of my going to, I don't know if anyone's going to the gym these days, going on a bike ride. Well, maybe if it's raining, it could rain really hard. And then when I'm looking outside in the morning and I have only, a half hour before my classes start or before work starts, I'm going to think to myself, like, I don't really want to get out of bed and get on the bike in the rain. So that's a scenario. And for every scenario like that you can come up with, you got to generate a list of all the things that could get in the way of you doing what's important to you in the long run. Then you come up with the then. So that's the if X happens, if it's raining, then, and then you make an affirmative statement and you say, if that happens. And so these poker players would say, like, if the guy next to me is trying to like outbid me and it's like an ego thing, and I know this guy's been a jerk to me in the past, then I'll like look up and I'll take 3 deep breaths. I'll cool myself off. Okay, so if it's raining and I'm meant to go on a bike ride, then I will put on some really fun music and just dress in like my warmest rainproof clothes, and I'll still get on the bike. So it's making these affirmative statements that essentially provide you a way to adhere to your long-term goals and objectives. And the other things these poker players do are that they set norms within their peer group. It's all about slow results, grinding away over time to get your earnings, and not about making rash decisions at the table. And a lot of that is informed. A lot of them are informed by kind of data, the odds.
Great, thank you. We have one last question. Leah Lubit would like to ask a question. So, Leah.
Hi. Thanks for coming and talking. I actually read your book recently, and it was really interesting. I've given it to some of my family members since. So I've always been a very sort of future oriented person, especially I'd say high school, and now I'm a freshman in college. And sometimes I find that I'm so focused on the future that I sort of forget to be present, and time can pass by really quickly. And I was wondering if you've ever found it difficult to balance being present and being focused on long-term goals, and how you manage that.
It's a great question. And I'm also one of those people. So when I first started thinking about this idea, I thought, well, doesn't it matter to be in the present moment, right? There's almost a kind of, it's like a Buddhist philosophy, or even just a life, right? Approach to life where you savor the moment you're in and you notice who you're with. And I have to say, during this pandemic, I haven't seen my parents in a year. And I think about moments I was with them and wish I would have just like taken the time a little bit more to savor the moment, take a few deep breaths and just make that moment longer. And so I wondered, when I was thinking about this book, like, is it actually good to think long-term all the time? Is it always good to be thinking about the future? Isn't it important to be in the present moment? And I think you're absolutely right. It's important to be in the present moment. I think the problem area, the problem temporal landscape that we too often visit in our daily lives and in our society is the temporal landscape of the immediate next. What is the next immediate thing I'm going to do? What is the next immediate target I need to hit, profit I need to make, thing I need to buy? And I think it's actually much more compatible to be a person who can relish the present moment and can also think across generations or across a longer time span of the future than it is to do either the future scanning or the present thing if you're always fixated on what's immediately next. So I think they are actually more compatible. And Isaac Newton wrote about the difference between apparent time and mathematical time. So mathematical time is, the time that we know is happening because of the movement of the celestial bodies. And apparent time or relative time is time as we experience it. And one of the things that's important in the literature that I looked at for this, and even just this intuitively, it's not going to be shocking when I say this, but when you experience time, your relative time is very quick. Every moment feels like it's too quick. You feel more urgency, and we tend to make decisions feeling that urgency. And I mentioned the impulsive decisions that throw away the long term, right? If we feel like the world is racing us by and that each moment we only have a little bit of time left, right? Oh, we have to rush from this thing to that thing. That also lends itself to sacrificing the future. So if we can elongate relative time, apparent time, by slowing down, by being connected to things that are longer living. And for me, because I'm a lover of nature, to stand next to a really old tree, to look at the ocean, right? To do those things is both to be in the present moment, if you observe them, if you touch them, if you look at the rhythm of the tides, but it's also to be connected to something that has endured over the ages, that will endure much longer than your life. So I think that's a nice way to connect the two. And I do encourage that kind of having those kinds of experiences with the timeless, where you can be in the present, but still contemplating what lasts and endures over future generations and what matters over time.
Well, thank you. That's great advice. So I'd like to just thank you again for sharing some time out of this busy election season that I'm sure is keeping your editorial board super busy. So Bina, thank you for joining us. And I look forward to seeing you virtually or in person some point in the future. Thank you.
I look forward to it too. Thank you. This was such a pleasure and such wonderful questions. Thanks so much to all of you. Thanks, Colin.
Bye-bye.